I have found that people are regularly confused by phono preamplifiers. So this video is going to explain what they are, what they do, how to use them and how not to use them. This is a record player and it's not plugged in, see? There's no power going to it. Yet if I put the stylus on the record and I turn it, there's no power running the motor, but sounds fine, other than the speed issues. This is because the actual sound amplification is not happening in the record player, it's happening in a preamplifier. Now, these preamplifiers can be built into your amplifier. You can recognize that when it has a little phono input. That's a dedicated input for your record player because it has a preamplifier right behind the input. Sometimes they're built into the record player and you can often turn them on or off. This record player has a built-in preamplifier. Right now it's off because it's not getting any power, but you can turn it on with a switch at the back. And then these days with modern record players, you often find that they have a built-in phono preamplifier because people need to be able to hook them up to Bluetooth speakers or small little powered speakers, which are speakers with an amplifier built in. So it's very useful for record players in 2021, or 22 as it is since yesterday, to have a built-in phono preamplifier. So what does it do? How does it work? Why do you need it? Here we go. There's no electronics in this record player, or in most record players, except for the motor. This arm, the cartridge, everything that produces sound and that doesn't have anything to do with the rotation is completely mechanical. There's little grooves in the record, you know that. They vibrate the stylus and that vibration goes into a little sort of motor, but it works in reverse. So instead of the motor turning something, little vibrations turn the motor. That creates electricity because that works both ways, and that goes through the wire into your phono preamplifier. And you can wonder, those tiny little vibrations, how can they possibly produce any sort of volume? They're so small, there's nothing amplifying them until they go into the preamplifier. And I'm sure you figured out by now, that's exactly what the preamplifier does. Let me grab a CD player, which doesn't need one, to explain the difference. Behold, CD player. Playing some royalty-free music. This CD player has what we call a line level output. And you may have seen a little sign saying line in or aux in on many devices. These devices accept a line level input. Now, most of the things you would use have a line level output. CD players, computers, cassette decks, your phone. It's all at least sort of line level and it's all compatible. Now, this CD player is now hooked directly into my mixing console, which also has line level inputs. And what I'm going to do now, you've seen it play, let me do it once more. I'm going to stop it playing and I'm going to grab the record player again. I'm not going to change anything, except I'm going to take the CD player away and put the record player in its place. See what happens. Right, the same cable that we see it works, just unplugged from the CD player, is now going into the outputs of the record player. And because I don't want to rotate the record by hand, I'm going to plug it in and we're going to play a record. There's something, but it's very thin sounding and very quiet. Let me turn it up a little in the computer. I would give it away just yeah, that's not a lot. So we have some sound, but it's extremely quiet. So let's now plug that record player into the phono preamplifier instead. Right, here goes. Let's see, what do we get? Alright, that works. So, record player needs a phono preamplifier. Some record players, I already said it to you, have built-in phono preamplifiers, and this is one of them. So there's a little switch on the back that I will show you that allows you to turn the phono preamplifier on and off. And when you turn it on, it preamplifies the sound volume to line level. So you can hook it up just like any CD player or computer or phone or whatever. I wanted to say Walkman, I'm not sure how I got there. I must be getting old. So here is that little switch. I'm going to switch it from phono to line. So right now we are preamplifying the sound of the record player in the record player. But we also, remember, hooked it up to a phono preamplifier, which is also preamplifying it. Seems a bit much? It is a bit much. So that's what happens. Let me turn it off again before I forget. That's what happens when you preamplify the preamplifier. It's too much. And that is where people often get it wrong, because they're like, oh, I have this old amplifier, and I heard it has a phono input, so I can hook it up to a record player. And then I get a modern record player with a built-in preamplifier. They leave it switched on, and they get that. And then they're like, well, that sounds like shit. Something must be broken. And that creates this whole problem where they think their devices are faulty and they send them back, and it's just a waste. So, here we go. An old-fashioned record player, an old one, this one sort of in between, has no built-in preamplifier. Exceptions exist, but it's very rare. So, unless your amplifier has a phono input, and it has to read phono, in some European countries it may read PU, unless it has that, you will not be able to use an old-fashioned record player on it. If your amplifier has a phono input, you can use any record player that has either no built-in preamplifier, or it has one that you can switch off, like this one, which is quite normal on most modern, slightly more upmarket players. If your amplifier has no phono input, you either need a record player with a built-in preamp or a separate preamp, which can be had for 30 euros and up. There's some really cheap ones that you really don't want. They buzz and they're noisy and they sound horrible. But from 30 euros and up, you can expect them to be acceptable. 30 euros is like $35. Now, if you were to accidentally hook up a record player with a built-in phono preamplifier to a phono input or to an already existing phono preamplifier, I just demonstrated it so you don't have to. It will not immediately destroy stuff, but I wouldn't do it if I were you. It may be a fun sound for a bit, but it's not great for the electronic components, so I wouldn't, but that's what happens. But what if you have a record player with a phono preamplifier and an amplifier with a phono preamplifier, and the record player has one that you can switch on and off? Which one should you use? Should you use the one in your amplifier, or should you use the one in the record player? I can't tell you, because I've been surprised by how good some of the phono preamplifiers built into modern record players are. Like the Audio-Technica ones are actually really good. And I'm also shocked by how bad some of the phono preamplifiers built into modern amplifiers are. So I would experiment. Just make sure that either you have your amplifier's phono input used, if you have one, and then you have to turn the phono preamplifier off on your record player, or you have to turn the phono preamplifier on your record player and you have to use a non-phono input on your amplifier. You will find out soon enough if you mess it up, because either you hear virtually nothing, very quiet, or it will be really distorted and muddy sounding. So if you get it wrong, you're just going to have to mess with the switches until it's correct. Once more, sound coming out of this is virtually nothing. You need something to preamplify it. And since you also hook up CD players and cassette decks, etc., only one input on your amplifier will have a built-in phono preamplifier. If it doesn't have a built-in phono preamplifier, you need a separate one. And if you don't have a separate one, or if you have a record player that has one built in, you need to turn it on the record player. Some really cheap record players have a built-in phono preamplifier that cannot be turned off. So if you buy a super cheap record player, like the ones that Lenko sells these days, you hook it up to a phono input and you get loads of distortion, you shouldn't have hooked it up to the phono input. It's not a problem, you just hook it up to any of the other inputs. Doesn't matter whether it's called tape, or CD, or aux, or tuner, it's all the same input, it's all line level input. This used to be different back in the 60s and 50s when we still used different connectors, they were called DIN, but these days it's all the same. So if you have a record player with a built-in phono preamplifier, you don't want to use the input that's labeled phono on your amplifier, unless you can turn it off on the record player, then you can. And then you just gonna have to compare and see which one sounds best of the two. But there you go, that's what happens if you hook it up wrong. And this is how a record player works. It's just vibrations, and they need to be amplified on the receiving end. There's no electronics in these record player that influence the sound. It's all just a motor control, or sometimes just a motor and a belt. And the sound is actually done completely mechanically, even though this is a modern record player. Not, you know, the old ones where you have to wind them up, that's also mechanical. But this is actually mechanical record playing at its finest, because it's a mechanical needle, that stylus that vibrates. It does get turned into electricity, but in the same way, you know, you have the hand crank flashlights. Yeah, that's also mechanical, but it also gets turned into electricity. This is pretty much the same. It turns a little vibration it has into electricity, and it's just enough for the phono preamplifier to pick it up and turn it into something your normal amplifier can use. So it takes a bit of thinking to figure out how this works, but that's the basics. And you want to make sure you get it right. And if your sound sounds like crap, you probably have some mismatching components. So either you have two preamplifiers hooked up to each other, loads of distortion, or you don't have a phono preamplifier or a phono input, and you have an old-fashioned record player that doesn't have one, then you need to buy a separate phono preamplifier. So I hope this answered some questions. I know it's a lot of information, but I want to get this as complete as possible, and I want to wish you all a very good night. Now, how did I hook this up now? It's hooked up to the phono preamplifier, and I think the phono preamplifier on this is off, so we should get clean sound. Yes!
And when I am king.
Guys, webcam quality me here. I'm done videoing, but I wanted to share something cool with you. While looking at the audio, I found something that you may find interesting. So I hooked up two phono preamplifiers to each other, the one in the record player and the one that I have connected to my mixing console. And because the sound got amplified twice, it picked up even more vibrations, and not just the ones coming from the record, but also the ones coming from the room. And if you listen carefully, before I turn it off, you can actually hear me speak because the stylus picked up my voice. It sounds horrible, but it proves that it's all just vibrations being amplified, and that's all. Have a listen.